AP European History: Themes and Key Concepts by Andrew Klink. Theme 1 is the interaction of Europe and the world. Beginning in the 15th century, European nations sent explorers into the world beyond the Mediterranean, establishing new shipping routes, trading stations, and eventually colonies in many parts of the globe. Motivations for these enterprises were complex and have been the subject of much historical debate. Were Europeans driven primarily by the desire for more direct and secure trade routes, by the pursuit of new commercial wealth, or by religious zeal, the desire to convert new peoples to Christianity? Whatever the motivations, these explorations created new complex trade systems that profoundly affected European prosperity, patterns of consumption, commercial competition, and national rivalries. The activities and influence of Europeans varied in different parts of the world. In India and China, centers of high civilization, Europeans remained on the periphery in trading stations for centuries. In Africa, they established themselves on the coast, trading with the indigenous populations of the interior. In the Americas, they created colonies and imposed their religious, social, and political institutions on the native peoples. Europeans also brought new diseases to the Americas, which hastened the collapse of the indigenous cultures on the continents. However, cross-cultural influence flowed in both directions. The encounters with non-European peoples profoundly affected European trade, social life, and ideas. With their American colonies and the global reach of their seafarers, Europeans helped create a truly global trading system, introducing new foods such as tomatoes, potatoes, peppers, and corn that changed the food cultures of China, India, and Europe. At the same time as Europe was experiencing the material consequences of its interactions with the world, European intellectuals began to describe and analyze the peoples and cultures with which they came into contact, and collect and catalog the flora and fauna they discovered. The use of race as a primary category for differentiating peoples coincided with the expansion of slavery. As Europeans sought a workforce for overseas plantations, this categorization helped Europeans justify the slave system. From the 16th to 19th century, the transatlantic slave trade became a central feature of the world economy, and millions of Africans were transported via the notorious Middle Passage to labor on plantations in the Americas. The vast and cruel slave system began to generate opposition in Europe beginning in the late 18th century. Abolitionists objected to the system on humanitarian and religious grounds, an important stand of Enlightenment thought. The belief in citizenship, popular sovereignty, equality, and liberty promoted by the American and French revolutions also contributed to the ideology of the abolitionist movements, and European states abolished the slave trade in the early 19th century. From the late 18th century to the era of decolonization, these Enlightenment principles influenced those who opposed Europe's global domination. Yet this critique of colonialism did not have an immediate effect, given that the 19th century proved to be a period of empire building. Driven by the needs of an industrial economy and nationalism, Europeans expanded their territorial control in Asia and Africa through warfare, the seizure of property, and in some cases, immigration. In the late 19th century, the scale and pace of conquest intensified because of asymmetries in military technology, communication, and national rivalries among the great powers. In conquered territories, Europeans established new administrative, legal, and cultural institutions, and reconstructed colonial economies to meet European needs. These actions often led to resistance in colonial areas. Within Europe, exposure to new peoples and cultures influenced art and literature, and spurred on efforts to find a scientific basis for racial differences. Competition for colonies also destabilized the European balance of power, and was a significant cause of World War I. In the mid-20th century, the rise of the United States as an economic and military power, 2 world wars, and the 4 decades-long Cold War led to a decolonization movement that diminished Europe's economic and diplomatic place in the world. At the end of the 20th century, Europe sought new ways of defining interactions among its own nations and with the rest of the world. At the same time, the migration of non-European peoples into Europe began to change the ethnic and religious composition of Europe society and to create uncertainties about European identity. Theme 2: Poverty and Prosperity. In the centuries after 1450, Europe first encountered and then gradually came to dominate a global commercial network. Building off the voyages of exploration and colonization, the commercial revolution of the 17th and 18th centuries involved a wide range of new financial and economic practices, such as joint stock companies, widely capitalized banks, and triangular trade, all of which supported an emerging money economy. New commercial techniques and goods provided Europeans with an improved diet and standard of living. Wealth from commerce supported in turn the growth of industrial capitalism in subsequent centuries. Commercial wealth helped transform a pre-industrial economy based on guild production, cottage industry, and subsistence agriculture into one driven by market operations. While market mechanisms generated wealth and social position for some, they also destabilized traditional patterns of economic activity, such as when the wages of urban artisans and workers declined in the 16th century because of the price revolution. Still, commercial wealth generated resources for centralizing states, many of which, prior to the French Revolution, justified government management of trade, manufacturing, finance, and taxation through the theory of mercantilism. Mercantilism assumed that existing sources of wealth could not be expanded. Accordingly, the only way to increase one's economic power over others was to gain a greater share of the existing sources of wealth. As a result, mercantilism promoted commercial competition and warfare overseas. Market demands generated the increasingly mechanized production of goods through the technology of the Industrial Revolution. Large-scale production required capital investment, which led to the development of capitalism, justified by Adam Smith through the concept of the invisible hand of the marketplace. The growth of large-scale agriculture and factories changed social and economic relations. Peasants left the countryside to work in new factories, giving up as tenants on landlords' estates for wage labor. Improved climate and diet supported a gradual population increase in the 18th century, and then came a seeming breakthrough of the Malthusian trap, the belief that population could not expand beyond the level of subsistence. With the population explosion in the industrial 19th century, industrialization generated unprecedented levels of material prosperity for some Europeans, particularly during the Second Industrial Revolution, when an outburst of new technologies ushered Europe into a modern mass society. Prosperity was never equally distributed, either geographically or by social class, and despite the wonders of the railroad and airplane, poverty never disappeared. Capitalism produced its own forms of poverty and social subjugation. It created financial markets that periodically crashed, putting people dependent on wages out of work and wiping out investors' capital. Its trading system shifted production from expansive to inexpensive regions, reducing or holding down the wages of workers. By the 19th century, conditions of economic inequality and the resultant social and political instability across Europe raised questions about the role evolving nation-states could or should play in economic lives of their subjects and citizens. Socialism argued for state ownership of property and economic planning to promote equality, and later Marxism developed a systematic economic and historical theory that inspired working-class movements and revolutions to overthrow the capitalist system. The devastating impact of two world wars and the Great Depression transformed pre-1914 economic patterns and complicated the task of governments in managing the unstable economic situation. Soviet Russia and its post-World War II satellites represented one path, while nations in the Western and Central Europe modified laissez-faire capitalism with Keynesian budget and tax policies and an expanding welfare state. Consumerism, always an important factor in economic growth, took on even more importance in the second half of the 20th century, although not without criticism. Perhaps the most significant change since World War II has been the movement towards European economic unity and a common currency. Although policies of unity have supported Europe's post-war economic miracle, they have also encountered challenges of a stagnating population, financial crisis, and growing social welfare commitments. Theme 3. Objective Knowledge and Subjective Vision. Starting in the 15th century, European thinkers began developing new methods for arriving at objective truth, substituting these methods for appeals to traditional authorities, and then gradually moved away from belief in absolute truth to increasingly subjective interpretations of reality. Although most early modern Europeans continued to rely on religious authority and ancient texts for their knowledge of the world and as a standard of value, an increasing number argued that direct inquiry, philosophical and scientific, was the principal way to formulate truths and representations of reality. Philosophers of the natural world created a new theory of knowledge based on observation and experimentation, along with new institutions to put these new theories into practice. Science came to be viewed as an objective source of truth about the natural world. Artists, musicians, and writers also employed empirical and quantitative methods to abstract the notions of space, time, and sound in new cultural movements, many of which continue to draw on classical subjects and motifs, such as the Renaissance. During the Enlightenment, educated Europeans came to accept the world as governed by natural laws, accessible through systematic observation and articulated in mathematics. The results of this intellectual movement were impressive, producing a new understanding of the universe, often designated as Newtonian physics, and systems to organize and advance the growing body of knowledge of plants and animals and minerals. Under the influence of the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution, intellectuals and activists attempted to employ a similarly scientific approach to the questions of political, social, and economic reform, resulting in the development of such ideologies as conservatism, liberalism, nationalism, socialism, and Marxism. Those in the fine arts and literature both applied and commented on these methods in their depictions of European life during this period of rapid change. Over time, the new method for acquiring knowledge through observation and experimentation raised questions about the relationship between the observer and the observed. Beginning in the 19th century, new theories called into question the supremacy of reason and the possibility of finding objective truth in favor of subjective interpretations of reality, and the importance of non-rational forces. In physics, quantum mechanics and Einstein's theories of relativity, which took the observers into account, challenged Newtonian mechanics, and in psychology, Freud emphasized the importance of irrational drives in human behavior. Beginning in the 19th century and accelerating into the 20th, European artists and intellectuals, along with a portion of the educated public, rejected absolute paradigms, whether idealist or scientific, replacing them with relative and subjective ones, as exemplified by existential philosophy, modern art, and postmodernist ideas and culture. The emergence of these ideas created a conflict between science and subjective approaches to knowledge. Europeans continued to engage in science and to regard the results of science as being a universal value, while postmodernist thinkers emphasized the subjective component, the role of the actor, in all human activities, including scientific ones. Theme 4. States and Other Institutions of Power. After 1450, the old ideal that Europe constituted a unified Christendom was weakened by the rise of sovereign states. These states asserted a monopoly over law and the management of all institutions, including the Church. The growth of secular power played a critical role in the success of the Protestant Reformation, and states gained increasing influence over religious affairs. The military revolution of the early modern period forced states to find new and better sources of revenue, and it spurred the expansion of state control over political and economic functions. In the long view, war became increasingly costly, technologically sophisticated, and deadly. As Europeans expanded overseas, the theaters of European warfare expanded as well. European politics took a variety of forms: empires, nation-states, and small republics. Absolute monarchies concentrated all authority in a single person who was regarded as divinely ordained, whereas in constitutional governments, power was shared between the monarch and representative institutions. Early modern advances in education, publishing, and prosperity created public opinion and civil society independent of government, developments that supported and were promoted by Enlightenment theories of natural rights and the social contract. Political revolutions and industrialization shifted governance from monarchies and aristocracies to parliamentary institutions that both generated and embodied the rule of law while gradually widening the participation of citizens in governance through the extension of suffrage. In the late 19th century, as European states became increasingly responsive to public opinion and developed mass political parties, they ironically became impersonal and bureaucratic. After World War I, under the pressure of political and economic crisis, totalitarian regimes threatened parliamentary governments. The European state system, originating in the Peace of Westphalia and structuring interstate relations through World War I, assumed that the continent would be divided into independent sovereign states and that the war and diplomacy would be the normal means of interstate relations. In the 19th century, the goal of establishing and maintaining a balance of power was challenged by the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. the emergence of Italy and Germany as states, and the weakening of traditional empires, and the shifts into alliance systems. New and hardened alliances between countries driven by overseas competition and the growing influence of nationalism undermined diplomatic efforts to stave off war in the first half of the 20th century. In the 20th century, new international organizations, the League of Nations, the United Nations, and NGOs, attempted to develop international law and modes of dispute resolution that would promote peace. After the catastrophe of two world wars, European states returned to the goal of a unified Europe, embodied this time not in Christendom, but in the secular institutions of the European Union. Theme 5: Individual and Society. Early modern society was divided into three estates: clergy, nobility, and commoners, the latter of which included merchants, townspeople, and the overwhelming majority, the peasantry. Within those estates, family and religion and landed wealth shaped social practices, and inequality of wealth prevailed within each estate. The poor were viewed as objects of charity or dangerous idlers requiring social control, such as disciplinary measures or confinement. Social values and communal norms were sanctified by religion. With the advent of the Reformation, new Protestant denominations clashed with the Catholic Church, and with each other to establish new religious practices and social values. Marriage and family life were constrained by the values of a community. Men, and especially women of all estates, followed closely prescribed norms. Gathering resources to create new households often required young adults to work and save for a period of years. In a late age of marriage for commoners, the European family pattern tended to limit demographic growth. In pre-industrial Europe, women and men's work was complementary rather than separate, as peasants worked communally to bring in the harvest, and artisanal women oversaw journeymen and apprentices, kept the books, and marketed the product. Despite female involvement in movements of cultural and social change, gender norms continued to stress women's intellectual inferiority and their duty of obedience to fathers and husbands, as well as limit their access to institutional power. The Protestant Reformation placed a new emphasis on the individual's direct relationship to God, and the role of women in the family as mothers and assistants in religious instruction and schooling. While excluding them from clerical roles, social and economic stresses along with negative gender stereotypes led to witchcraft persecution, which victimized elderly women in particular in the 16th and 17th centuries. Demographic growth spurred social change in the 18th century. The Enlightenment brought a new emphasis on childhood as a stage of life, and the ideal of companionship marriage began to compete with arranged marriages. The French Revolution formally ended the division of society into three estates and continued to challenge traditional society throughout the 19th century. Though remnants of the old order persisted in the 20th century, the Industrial Revolution created a division of social classes based on new criteria of capital and labor. The revolutionary emphasis on liberty galvanized many excluded groups to take an active role in politics, and the language of natural rights spurred the development of movements of equality such as feminism and the end of feudalism and serfdom. The growth of the middle class in the 19th century tended to anchor men and women in separate spheres and elevate women's roles into the home into the cult of domesticity. Early industrialism negatively affected the working class and more generally shifted the family from a unit of production to one of consumption. By the late 19th century, a new mass of society had emerged, defined by consumerism, expanding literacy, and new forms of leisure. The women question that had emerged in the 17th century took a new intensity as women sought economic and legal rights. World War I profoundly affected European society by conclusively ending the residual hold of old elites on power and democratizing society through the shared sacrifice, represented by female suffrage in many nations. Between the wars, Soviet communism theoretically endorsed equality, yet women often performed double duty as laborers and mothers, while kulaks were considered enemies of the state and thus liquidated. On the other hand, fascist regimes re-emphasized the domestic role for women and created states based on the mythical racial identity. After World War II, the welfare state emerged in Western Europe with more support for families, choices in reproduction, state-sponsored health care. Economic recovery brought new consumer choices in popular culture. In the Soviet bloc, family life was constrained and controlled by states dedicated to heavy industry rather than consumer goods. though basic needs such as housing, healthcare, and employment and education were provided within an authoritarian context. The end of the Cold War and the rise of the European Union brought some shared social values to light, as well as contested issues of immigration, guest workers, and the shifting religious and ethnic balance of Europe. Immigrants sometimes challenged secularism in European life and reasserted their religious values. European society has become, with fits and starts, a pluralistic one. Key Concept 1.1. The worldview of European intellectuals shifted from one based on ecclesiastical and classical authority to one primarily on inquiry and observation of the natural world. Renaissance intellectuals and artists revived classical motifs in the fine arts and classical values in literature and education. Intellectuals, later called humanists, employed new methods of textual criticism based on deep knowledge of Greek and Latin, and revived classical ideas that made human beings the measure of all things. Artists formulated new styles based on ancient models. The humanists remained Christians while promoting ancient philosophical ideas that challenged traditional Christian views. Artists and architects such as Brunelleschi, Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael glorified human potential and the human form in the visual arts, basing their art on classical models while using new techniques of painting and drawing, such as geometric perspective. The invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century accelerated the development and dissemination of these new attitudes, notably in Europe north of the Alps, the Northern Renaissance. During the 16th and 17th centuries, Europeans developed new approaches to and methods for looking at the natural world in what historians have called the scientific revolution. Aristotle's classical cosmology and Ptolemy's astronomical systems came under increasing scrutiny from natural philosophers, later called scientists, such as Copernicus, Galileo, and Newton. The philosophers Francis Bacon and René Descartes articulated comprehensive theories of inductive and deductive reasoning to give the emerging scientific method of sound foundation. Bacon urged the collection and analysis of data about the world and spurred the development of an international community of natural philosophers dedicated to vast enterprise of what came to be called natural science. In medicine, the new approach to knowledge led physicians such as William Harvey to undertake observations that produced new explanations of anatomy and physiology, and who challenged the traditional theory of health and disease, the four humors, espoused by Galen in the 2nd century. The articulation of natural laws, often expressed mathematically, became the goal of science. The unexpected encounter with the Western Hemisphere at the end of the 15th century further undermined knowledge derived from classical and biblical authorities. The explorations produced new knowledge of geography and the world's peoples through direct observation, and this seemed to give credence to new approaches to knowledge more generally. Yet while they developed inquiry-based epistemologies, Europeans also continued to use traditional explanations of the natural world based on witchcraft, magic, alchemy, and astrology. A revival of classical texts led to new methods of scholarship and new values of both society and religion. Italian Renaissance humanists promoted a revival in classical literature and created new philosophical approaches to ancient texts. Some Renaissance humanists furthered the values of secularism and individualism, such as Petrarch, Lorenzo Valla, Marsilio Ficini, and Pico della Mirandola. Humanist revival of Greek and Roman texts, spread by the printing press, challenged the institutional power of universities and the Roman Catholic Church, and shifted the focus of education away from the theology towards the study of the classical texts, such as Leonardo Bruni, Leon Battista Alberti, and Niccolò Machiavelli. Admiration for Greek and Roman political institutions supported a revival of civic humanist cultures in the Italian city-states and produced secular models for individual and political behavior, such as Niccolò Machiavelli, Jean Bodin, Baldassare Castiglione, and Francesco Guicciardini. The invention of the printing press in the 1450s aided in the spreading of the Renaissance beyond Italy and encouraged the growth of vernacular literature, which would eventually contribute to the development of national cultures. Protestant reformers used the press to disseminate their ideas, which spurred religious reform and helped it to become widely established. Princes and popes, concerned with enhancing their prestige, commissioned paintings and architectural works based on classical styles, and often employed the newly invented technique of geometric perspective, such as Michelangelo, Donatello, Raphael, Andrea Palladio, Leon Battista Alberti, and Filippo Brunelleschi. A human-centered naturalism that considered individuals in everyday life appropriate objects of artistic representation was encouraged through the patronage of both princes and commercial elites, such as Raphael, Da Vinci, Van Eyck, Peter Bruegel, and Rembrandt. Mannerists and Baroque artists employed distortion, drama, and illusion in works commissioned by monarchies, city-states, and the church for public buildings to promote their stature and power, such as El Greco, Gentileschi, Bernini, and Rubens. New ideas in science based on observation, experimentation, and mathematics challenged classical views of the cosmos, nature, and human body, although folk traditions of knowledge and the universe persisted. New ideas and methods in astronomy led individuals such as Copernicus, Galileo, and Newton to question the authority of the ancients and religions to develop a heliocentric view of the cosmos. Anatomical and medical discoveries by physicians, including William Harvey, presented the body as an integrated system, challenging the traditional humoral theory of the body and the disease espoused by Galen, such as Paracelsus and Vesalius. Francis Bacon and René Descartes defined inductive and deductive reason and promoted experimentation and the use of mathematics, which would ultimately shape the scientific method. Alchemy and astrology continued to appeal to elites and some natural philosophers, in part because they shared with the new science the notion of predictable and knowledgeable universe, and in the oral culture of peasants, a belief that the cosmos was governed by divine and demonic forces persisted. Paracelsus, Cardano, Kepler, and Newton are examples of these. Key concepts. 1.2. The struggle for sovereignty within and among states resulted in varying degrees of political centralization. Three trends shaped early modern political development: from decentralized power and authority toward centralization, from a political elite consisting primarily of hereditary landed nobility toward one open to men distinguished by their education, skills, and wealth, and from religious towards secular norms of law and justice. One innovation promoting state centralization and the transformation of the landed nobility was the new dominance of firearms and artillery on the battlefield. The introduction of these new technologies, along with changes in tactics and strategies, amounted to a military revolution that reduced the role of mounted knights in castles, raised the cost of maintaining military power beyond the means of individual lords, and led to professionalism of the military on land and sea under the authority of the sovereign. This military revolution favored rulers who could command the resources required for building increasingly complex fortifications and fielding disciplined infantry and artillery units. Monarchs who could increase taxes and create bureaucracies to collect and spend them on their military outmaneuvered those who could not. In general, monarchs gained power vis-a-vis the corporate groups and institutions that had thrived during the medieval period, notably the landed nobility and the clergy. Commercial and professional groups such as merchants, lawyers, and other educated and talented persons acquired increasingly power in the state, often in alliance with the monarchs, alongside or in places of these traditional corporate groups. New legal and political theories, embodied in the codification of law, strengthened state institutions, which increasingly took control of social and economic order from traditional religious and local bodies. However, these developments were not universal. In Eastern and Southern Europe, the traditional elites maintained their positions in many polities. The centralization of power within polities took place within and facilitated a new diplomatic framework among states. Ideals of universal Christian empire declined, along with the power and prestige of the Holy Roman Empire, which was able to overcome the challenges of political localism and religious pluralism. By the end of the 30 Years' War, a new state system had emerged based on sovereign nation-states and the balance of power. The new concept of the sovereign state and secular systems of law played a central role in the creation of new political institutions. New monarchies laid the foundation for centralized modern state by establishing a monopoly of tax collection, military force, and dispensing of justice, and gaining the right to determine the religion of their subjects. These are seen in Ferdinand and Elizabeth of Spain's consolidating control of the military, the Star Chamber, the Concordat of Bologna, Peace of Augsburg, and the Edict of Nantes. The Peace of Westphalia of 1648, which marked the effective end of the medieval ideal of universal Christendom, accelerated the decline of the Holy Roman Empire by granting princes and bishops and other local leaders control over religion. Across Europe, commercial and professional groups gained in power and played a greater role in political affairs, such as merchants and financiers in Renaissance Italy and Northern Europe, nobles of the robe in France, and gentry in England. Secular political theories, such as those espoused in Machiavelli's The Prince, provided a new concept of the state, such as Jean Bodin and Hugo Grotius. The competitive state system led to new patterns of diplomacy and new forms of warfare. Following the Peace of Westphalia, religion no longer was a cause for warfare among European states. Instead, the concept of the balance of power played an important role in structuring diplomatic and military objectives. Advances in military technology, i.e. the military revolution, led to new forms of warfare, including the greater reliance on infantry, firearms, mobile cannon, and more elaborate fortifications, all financed by heavier taxation and requiring a larger bureaucracy. Technology, tactics, and strategies tipped the balance of power towards states able to marshal insufficient resources for the new military environment, seen in Spain under the Habsburgs, Sweden under Gustavus Adolphus, and in France. The competition for power between monarchs and the corporate groups produced different distribution of government authority in European states. The English Civil War, a conflict between the monarchy, parliament, and other elites over their respective roles in the political structure, exemplified this competition, seen with James I, Charles I, and Oliver Cromwell. Monarchies seeking enhanced power faced challenges from nobles who wished to retain traditional forms of shared governance and regional autonomy, such as Louis XIII and Cardinal Richelieu, the Fronde in France, and the Catalan revolts in Spain. Key Concept 1.3. Religious pluralism challenged the concept of a unified Europe. Late medieval reform movements in the Church, including lay piety, mysticism, and Christian humanism, created a momentum that propelled a new generation of 16th century reformers such as Erasmus and Martin Luther. After 1517, when Luther posted his 95 Theses attacking ecclesiastical abuses and the doctrine that spawned them, Christianity fragmented even though religious uniformity remained the ideal. Some states, such as Spain and Portugal, which had recently expelled Muslims and Jews, held fast to this ideal. Others, notably the Netherlands and lands under Ottoman control, which accepted Jewish refugees, did not. In Central Europe, the Peace of Augsburg of 1555 permitted each state of the Holy Roman Empire to be either Catholic or Lutheran at the option of the prince. By the late 16th century, northern European countries were generally Protestant and Mediterranean countries generally Catholic. To re-establish order after the period of religious warfare, France introduced limited toleration of the minority Calvinists within the Catholic kingdom, Edict of Nantes of 1598, which was revoked in 1685. Jews remained a marginalized minority wherever they lived. Differing conceptions of salvation and the individual's relationship to the Church were at the heart of the conflicts among Luther, subsequent Protestant reformers such as Calvin and Anabaptists, and the Roman Catholic Church. The Catholic Church affirmed its traditional theology at the Council of Trent from 1545 to 1563, ruling out any reconciliations with the Protestants and inspiring the resurgence of Catholicism in the 17th century. Religious conflicts inevitably emerged with and exacerbated long-standing political tensions between the monarchies and nobility across Europe, dramatically escalating these conflicts as they spread from the Holy Roman Empire to France, Netherlands, and England. Economic issues, such as the power of the tax to control ecclesiastical resources, further heightened these clashes. All three motivations, religious, political, and economic, contributed to the brutal and destructive 30 Years' War, which was ended by the Peace of Westphalia of 1648. The treaty published a new balance of power with a weakened Holy Roman Empire. The Peace of Westphalia also added Calvinism to Catholicism and Lutheranism as accepted religions of the Holy Roman Empire, ensuring the permanence of European religious pluralism. However, pluralism did not mean religious freedom. The prince or ruler still controlled the religion of the state, and few were tolerant of dissenters. The Protestant and Catholic Reformations fundamentally changed theology, religious institutions, and culture. Christian humanism embodied the writings of Erasmus and employed Renaissance learning in the service of religious reform, seen with Sir Thomas More and Juan Louis Vives. Reforming Martin Luther and John Calvin, as well as religious radicals such as Anabaptists, criticized Catholic abuses and established new interpretations of Christian doctrine and practice. such as indulgences, nepotism, simony, and pluralism and absenteeism. The Catholic Reformation, exemplified by the Jesuit order in the Council of Trent, revived the Church and cemented the division within Christianity, seen as in St. Teresa of Avila, Ursulinus, Roman Inquisition, and the Index of Prohibited Books. Religious reform both increased state control of religious institutions and provided justifications for challenging state authority. Monarchs and princes, such as English rulers Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, initiated religious reform from top down, magisterial in an effort to exercise greater control over religious life and morality, such as the Spanish Inquisition, Concordat of Bologna in 1516, Book of Common Prayer, and the Peace of Augsburg. Some Protestants, including Calvin and Anabaptists, refused to recognize the subordination of the Church to the state. Religious conflicts became a basis of challenging the monarch's control of religious institutions, seen with the Huguenots, Puritans, and nobles in Poland. Conflicts among religious groups overlap with political and economic competition within and among states. Issues of religious reform exacerbated conflicts between the monarchy and the nobility, as in the French Wars of Religion, with Catherine de' Medici, St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, War of the Three Henrys, and Henry IV. The efforts of Habsburg rulers failed to restore Catholic unity across Europe. These are seen in Charles I or V, Philip II, Philip III, and Philip IV. States exploited religious conflicts to promote political and economic interests, seen with Catholic Spain and Protestant England, France, Sweden, and Denmark in the 30 Years' War. A few states, such as France with the Edict of Nantes, allowed religious pluralism in order to maintain domestic peace. This is seen in Poland and the Netherlands. Key Concept 1.4. Europeans explored and settled overseas territories, encountering and interacting with indigenous populations. From the 15th through the 17th century, Europeans used their mastery of the seas to extend their power in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. In the 15th century, the Portuguese sought direct access by sea to the sources of African gold, ivory, and slaves. At the same time, the rise of Ottoman power in the eastern Mediterranean led to Ottoman control of the Mediterranean trade routes and increased the motivation of Iberians and then northern Europeans to explore possible sea routes to the east. The success and consequences of these explorations and the maritime expansion that followed rested on European adoption of Muslim and Chinese navigational technology, as well as advances in military technology and cartography. Political, economic, and religious rivalries among Europeans also stimulated maritime expansion. By the 17th century, Europeans had forged a global trade network that gradually edged out Muslim and Chinese dominion in the Indian Ocean and the Western Pacific. In Europe, these successes shifted economic power within Europe from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic states. In Asia, the Portuguese, Spanish, and Dutch competed for control of trade routes and trading stations. In the Americas, the Spanish and Portuguese led in the establishment of colonies, followed by the Dutch, French, and English. The pursuit of colonies was sustained by mercantilist economic theory, which promoted government management of economic imperatives and policies. The creation of maritime empires was also animated by the religious fervor sweeping Europe during the period of the Reformations, Catholic and Protestant. Global European expansion led to the conversion of indigenous populations in South and Central America to an exchange of commodities and crops that enriched European and other civilizations that became part of the global trading network, and eventually to migrations that had profound effects on Europe. The expansion also challenged parochial worldviews in Christian Europe. Yet the Columbian Exchange also unleashed several ecological disasters, notably the death of vast numbers of America's population and epidemics of European diseases, such as smallpox and measles, against which the native population had no defense. The establishment of the plantation system in the American colonies also led to vast expansion of the African slave trade, one feature of the new Atlantic trading system. European nations were driven by commercial and religious motives to explore overseas territories and establish colonies. European states sought to direct access to gold and spices and luxury goods as a means to enhance personal wealth and state power. The rise of mercantilism gave the state a new role in promoting commercial development and the acquisition of colonies overseas. Christianity served as a stimulus for exploration as governments and religious authorities sought to spread the faith and counter Islam, and as a justification for the physical and cultural subjugation of indigenous civilizations. Advances in navigation, cartography, and military technology allowed Europeans to establish overseas colonies and empires. This is seen in the compass, stern post rudder, portolani, quadrant and astrolabe, and the lateen rig. Also seen with new military technologies of horses, guns, and gunpowder. Europeans established overseas empires and trade networks through coercion and negotiation. The Portuguese established a commercial network along the African coast, in South and East Asia, and in South America. The Spanish established colonies across the Americas, the Caribbean, and the Pacific, which made Spain a dominant state in Europe. The Atlantic nations of France, England, and the Netherlands followed by establishing their own colonies and trading networks to compete with Portuguese and Spanish dominance. The competition for trade led to conflicts and rivalries among European powers. Europe's colonial expansion led to a global exchange of goods, flora and fauna, cultural practices, and diseases, resulting in the destruction of some indigenous civilizations, a shift towards European dominance, and the expansion of the slave trade. The exchange of goods shifted the center of economic power in Europe from the Mediterranean and the Atlantic states and brought the latter into an expanding world economy. The exchange of new plants and animals and diseases, the Columbian exchange, created economic opportunities for Europeans and facilitated European subjugation and destruction of indigenous peoples, particularly in the Americas. These are seen in From Europe to the Americas, wheat, cattle, horses, pigs, sheep, smallpox, and measles, and From the Americas to Europe in tomatoes, potatoes, squash, corn, tobacco, turkeys, and syphilis. Europeans expanded the African slave trade in response to the establishment of plantation economy in the Americas and demographic catastrophes among indigenous peoples. Key Concept 1.5. European society and the experiences of everyday life are increasingly shaped by commercial and agricultural capitalism, notwithstanding the persistence of medieval social and economic structures. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Europeans experienced profound economic and social changes. The influx of precious metals from the Americas and the gradual recovery of Europe's population from the Black Death caused a significant rise in the cost of goods and services in the 16th century, known as the Price Revolution. The new pattern of economic enterprises and investment that arose from these changes would come to be called capitalism. Family-based banking houses were supplanted by broadly integrated capital markets in Genoa, then in Amsterdam, and later in London. These and other urban centers became increasingly active consumer markets for a variety of luxury goods and commodities. Rulers soon recognized that capitalist enterprise offered them a revenue source to support state functions and competition among states was extended into the economic arena. The drive for economic profit and the increasing scale of commerce stimulated the creation of joint stock companies to conduct overseas trade and colonization. Many Europeans found their daily lives altered by these demographic and economic changes. As population increased in the 16th century, the price of grain rose and diets deteriorated, all as monarchs were increasing taxes to support their larger state militaries. All but the wealthy were vulnerable to food shortages, and even the wealthy had no immunity to recurrent lethal epidemics. Although hierarchy and privilege continued to define the social structure, the nobility and gentry expanded with the infusion of new blood from the commercial and professional classes. By the mid-17th century, war, economic contraction, and slackening population growth contributed to the disintegration of older communal values. Growing numbers of the poor became beggars and vagabonds, straining the traditional systems of charity and social control. In Eastern Europe, commercial development lagged and traditional social patterns persisted. The nobility actually increased its power over the peasantry. Traditional town governments, dominated by craft guilds and traditional religious institutions, staggered under the burden of rural migrants and growing poverty. The Reformation and Counter-Reformation stimulated a drive to regulate public morals, leisure activities, and the distribution of poor relief. In both town and country, the family remained the dominant unit of production, and marriage remained an instrument of families' social and economic strategies. The children of peasants and craft workers often labored alongside their parents. In the lower order societies, men and women did not occupy separate spheres, although they performed different tasks. Economics often dictated later marriages, European marriage pattern. However, there were exceptions to this pattern. In the cities of Renaissance Italy, men in their early 30s often married teenage women, and in Eastern Europe, early marriage for both men and women persisted. Despite the growth market economy in which individuals increasingly made their own way, leisure activities tended to be communal rather than individualistic and consumerist, as they are today. Local communities enforced their customs and norms through crowd action and rituals of public shaming. Economic changes produced new social patterns while traditions of hierarchy and status persisted. Innovations in banking and finance promoted the growth of urban financial centers and money economy. These included double-entry bookkeeping, the Bank of Amsterdam, the Dutch East India Company, and the British East India Company. The growth of commerce produced new economic elite, which related to traditional elites in different ways in Europe's various geographic regions, including the gentry in England, nobles of the robe in France, town elites, bankers and merchants, and caballeros and hidalgos in Spain. Hierarchy and status continue to define social power and perceptions in rural and urban settings. Most Europeans derived their livelihood from agriculture and oriented their lives around the seasons, the village, or the manor, although economic changes began to alter rural productions and power. Subsistence agriculture was the rule in most areas, with 3-crop field rotation in the north and 2-crop rotation in the Mediterranean. In many cases, farmers paid rents and labor services for their land. The price revolution contributed to the accumulation of capital and the expansion of the market economy through the commercialization of agriculture, which benefited large landowners in Western Europe. This included the enclosure movement, restricted use of village common, and freehold tenure. As Western Europe moved towards a free peasantry and commercial agriculture, serfdom was codified in the East, where nobles continued to dominate economic life in large estates. The attempts of landlords to increase their revenues by restricting or abolishing traditional rights of peasants led to revolt. Population shifts and growing commerce caused the expansion of cities, which often found their traditional political and social structures stressed by the growth. Population recovered to its pre-plague level in the 16th century, and continuing population pressures contributed to uneven price increases. Agricultural commodities increased more sharply than wages, reducing living standards for some. Migrants to the cities challenged the ability of merchant elites and craft guilds to govern constrained resources. This included sanitation problems caused by overpopulation, employment, poverty, and crime. Social dislocation, coupled with the weakening of religious institutions during the Reformation, left city governments with the task of regulating public morals. This included new secular laws regulating private life, stricter codes on prostitution and begging, and abolishing or restricting Carnival and Calvin's Geneva. The family remained the primary social and economic institution of early modern Europe and took several forms, including the nuclear family. Rural and urban households worked as units, with men and women engaged in separate but complementary tasks. The Renaissance and Reformation movements raised debates about female roles in the family, society, and in the church, including women's intellect and education, women as preachers, and Le Querelle des Femmes. From the late 16th century forward, Europeans responded to economic and environmental challenges such as the Little Ice Age by delaying marriage and childbearing, which restrained population growth and ultimately improved the economic condition of families. Popular culture, leisure activities, and rituals reflecting the persistence of folk ideas reinforced and sometimes challenged communal ties and norms. Leisure activities continued to be organized according to the religious calendar, and the agricultural cycle remained communal in nature. This included saints' days festivals, carnival, and blood sports. Local and church authorities continued to enforce communal norms through rituals of public humiliation, including charivari, stocks, and public whipping and branding. Reflecting folk ideas and social and economic upheaval, accusations of witchcraft peaked between 1580 and 1650. Key Concept 2.1. Different models of political sovereignty affected the relationship among states and between states and individuals. Between 1648 and 1815, the sovereign state was consolidated as the principal form of political organization across Europe. Justified and rationalized by theories of political sovereignty, states adopted a variety of methods to acquire the human, fiscal, and material resources essential for the promotion of their interests. Although challenged and sometimes effectively resisted by various social groups and institutions, the typical state of the period, best exemplified by the rule of Louis XIV in France, asserted claims to absolute authority within its borders. A few states, most notably England and the Dutch Republic, gradually developed governments in which the authority of the executive were restricted by legislative bodies protecting the interest of the landowning and commercial classes. Between the Peace of Westphalia of 1648 and the Congress of Vienna of 1814 and 15, European states managed their external affairs with a balance of power system. In this system, diplomacy became a major component of the relations among states. Most of the wars of the period, including conflicts fought outside of Europe, stemmed from attempts either to preserve or disturb the balance of power among European states. While European monarchs continued to view their affairs in dynastic terms, increasingly reasons for state influenced policy. The French Revolution was the most formidable challenge to traditional politics and diplomacy during this period, inspired in part by Enlightenment ideas. The revolution produced mass politics, led to the creation of numerous political and social ideologies, and remained the touchstone for those advocating radical reform in subsequent decades. The French Revolution was part of a larger revolutionary impulse that had a transatlantic movement, influenced revolutions in Spanish America, and the Haitian slave revolt. Napoleon Bonaparte built upon the gains of the revolution and attempted to exploit the resources of the continent in the interests of France and his own dynasty. Napoleon's revolutionary state imposed French hegemony throughout Europe, but eventually a coalition of European powers overthrew French domination and restored as much as possible a balance of power within the European state system. At the same time, the conservative powers attempted to suppress the ideologies inspired by the French Revolution. In much of Europe, absolute monarchy was established over the course of the 17th and 18th century. Absolute monarchies limited the nobility's participation in the governance, but preserved the aristocracy's social position and legal privileges, including James I of England, Peter the Great of Russia, Philip II, III, and IV of Spain. Louis XIV and his finance minister Jean-Baptiste Colbert extended the administrative, financial, military, and religious control of the central state over the French population. In the 18th century, a number of states in Eastern and Central Europe experienced with enlightened absolutism, including Frederick II of Prussia and Joseph II of Austria. The inability of Polish monarchy to consolidate authority over the nobility led to Poland's partition by Prussia, Russia, and Austria, and its disappearance from the map of Europe. Peter the Great westernized the Russian state and society, transforming political, religious, and cultural institutions. Catherine the Great continued this process. Challenges to absolutism resulted in alternative political systems. The outcome of the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolutions protected the rights of the gentry and aristocracy from absolutism through assertions of the rights of Parliament. This is seen in the English Bill of Rights and popular sovereignty, or parliamentary sovereignty. The Dutch Republic developed an oligarchy of urban gentry and rural landholders to promote trade and protect traditional rights. After 1648, dynastic and state interests, along with Europe's expanding colonial empires, influenced the diplomacy of European states and frequently led to war. As a result of the Holy Roman Empire's limitation of sovereignty in the Peace of Westphalia, Prussia rose to power, and the Habsburgs, centered in Austria, shifted their empire eastward. This is seen with Maria Theresa of Austria, Frederick William I of Prussia, and Frederick II of Prussia. After the Austrian defeat of the Turks in 1683 at the Battle of Vienna, the Ottomans ceased their westward expansion. Louis XIV's nearly continuous wars pursuing both dynastic and state interests provoked a coalition of European powers opposing him, seen in the Dutch War, the 9 Years' War, and the War of Spanish Succession. Rivalry between Britain and France resulted in world wars fought in Europe and in the colonies, with Britain supplanting France as the greatest European power. The French Revolution posed a fundamental challenge to Europe's existing political and social order. The French Revolution resulted from a combination of long social and political causes as well as Enlightenment ideas exacerbated by short-term fiscal and economic crises. The first, or liberal phase of the French Revolution, established a constitutional monarchy, increased popular participation, nationalized the Catholic Church, and abolished hereditary privileges. This is seen in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, Civil Constitution of the Clergy, Constitution of 1791, and the abolition of provinces and division of France into departments. After the execution of Louis XVI, the radical Jacobin Republic, led by Robespierre, responded to opposition at home and war abroad by instituting the Reign of Terror, fixing prices and wages, and pursuing a policy of de-Christianization. These were seen with Georges Danton, Jean-Paul Marat, and the Committee of Public Safety. Revolutionary armies raised by mass conscription sought to bring the changes initiated in France to the rest of Europe. Women enthusiastically participated in the early phases of the revolution. However, while there was brief improvement in the legal status of women, citizenship in the Republic was soon restricted to men. The French Revolution posed a fundamental challenge to Europe's existing political and social order. Revolutionary ideals inspired a slave revolt led by Toussaint Louverture in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, which became an independent nation of Haiti in 1804. While many were inspired by the revolution's emphasis on equality and human rights, Others condemned its violence and disregard for traditional authority. The French Revolution posed a fundamental challenge to Europe's existing and political social orders. Claiming to defend their ideals of the French Revolution, Napoleon Bonaparte imposed French control over much of the European continent that eventually provoked a nationalistic reaction. As first consul and emperor, Napoleon undertook a numerous of enduring domestic reforms while often curtailing some rights and manipulating popular impulses behind a facade of representative institutions. These are seen with his careers open to talent, educational system, centralized bureaucracy, civil code, and the Concordat of 1801. He used secret police, censorship, and limited women's rights. Napoleon's new military tactics allowed him to exert direct and indirect control over much of the European continent, spreading the ideals of the French Revolution across Europe. Napoleon's expanding empire created nationalistic responses throughout Europe. After the defeat of Napoleon by a coalition of European powers, the Congress of Vienna of 1814-15 attempted to restore the balance of power in Europe and contain the dangers of revolutionary or nationalistic upheavals in the future. Key Concept 2.2. The expansion of European commerce accelerated the growth of a worldwide economic network. The economic watershed of the 17th and 18th centuries was a historically unique passage from limited resources that made material want inescapable to self-generating economic growth that dramatically raised levels of physical and material well-being. European societies, first those with access to the Atlantic and gradually those to the east on the Mediterranean, provided increasing percentages of their population with a higher standard of living. The gradual emergence of new economic structures that made European global influence possible both presupposed and promoted far-reaching changes in human capital, property rights, financial instruments, technologies, and labor systems. These changes included the availability of labor power, both in terms and numbers and in terms of persons with skills, literacy, ability to understand and manipulate the natural world, physical health sufficient for work, required for efficient production. Institutions and practices that supported economic activity and provided incentives for it, new definitions of property rights and protections for them against theft and confiscation and against state taxation, accumulations of financing enterprises and innovations, as well as raising the standard of living, the means of turning private savings into investable or venture capital, technological innovations in food production, transportation, communication, and manufacturing. A major result of these changes was the development of a growing consumer society that benefited from and contributed to the increase in material resources. At the same time, other effects of the economic revolution increased geographic mobility, transformed employer-worker relations, the decline of domestic manufacturing, and eroded traditional community and family solidarities of protections. European economic strength derived in part from the ability to control and exploit resources, human and material, around the globe. Mercantilism supported the development of European trade and influence around the world. However, the economic, social, and demographic and ecological effects of European exploitations on other regions were often devastating. Internally, Europe divided more and more sharply between the societies engaging in overseas trade and undergoing the economic transformations sketched above, primarily countries on the Atlantic and those primarily in Central and Eastern Europe. With little such involvement, the Eastern European countries remained in a traditional, principally agrarian economy and maintained the traditional order of society in the state that rested on it. Early modern Europe developed a market economy that provided the foundation for its global role. Labor and trade in commodities were increasingly freed from traditional restrictions imposed by governments and corporate entities, seen in market-driven wages and prices and the laissez-faire laws. The agricultural revolution raised productivity and increased the supply of food and other agricultural products. The putting out system, or cottage industry, expanded as increasing numbers of laborers in homes or workshops produced for markets through merchant intermediaries or workshop owners. The development of the market economy led to new financial practices and institutions, including insurance, banking institutions for turning private savings into venture capital, new definitions of property rights and the protections against confiscation, and the Bank of England. The European-dominated worldwide economic network contributed to the agricultural, industrial, and consumer revolutions in Europe. European states followed mercantilistic policies by exploiting colonies in the New World and elsewhere. The transatlantic slave labor system expanded in the 17th and 18th centuries as the demand for New World products increased, including the Middle Passage, triangular trade, plantation economies in the Americas. Overseas products and influences contributed to the development of consumer culture in Europe, including sugar, tea, silks and other fabrics, tobacco, rum, and coffee. The importation and transportation of agricultural products from the Americas contributed to an increase in the food supply in Europe. Foreign lands provided raw materials, finished goods, and laborers, and markets for the commercial and industrial enterprises in Europe. The European-dominated worldwide economic network contributed to the agricultural, industrial, and consumer revolutions in Europe. Commercial rivalries influenced diplomacy and warfare among European states in the early modern era. European sea powers vied for Atlantic influence throughout the 18th century. Portuguese, Dutch, French, and British rivalries in Asia culminated in British domination in India and Dutch control of the East Indies. Key Concept 2.3: the popularization and dissemination of the scientific revolution and the application of its methods to political, social, and ethical issues that led to an increased, although not unchallenged, emphasis on reason in European culture. During the 17th and 18th centuries, Europeans applied the methods of the new science, such as empiricism, mathematics, and skepticism, to human affairs. During the Enlightenment, intellectuals such as Rousseau, Voltaire, and Diderot aimed to replace faith in divine revelation with faith in human reason and classical values. In economics and politics, liberal theorists such as John Locke and Adam Smith questioned absolutism and mercantilism by arguing for the authority of natural law and the market. Belief in progress, along with improved social and economic conditions, spurred significant gains in literacy and education, as well as the creation of new culture of the printed word, including novels, newspapers, periodicals, and such references works as Diderot's Encyclopedia for growing educated audiences. Several movements of religious revival occurred during the 18th century, but elite cultures embraced skepticism, secularism, and atheism for the first time in European history, and popular attitudes began to move in the same direction. From the beginning of this period, Protestants and Catholics grudgingly tolerated each other following the religious warfare of the previous 2 centuries. By 1800, most governments had extended toleration to Christian minorities, and in some states even to Jews. Religion was viewed increasingly as a matter of private rather than public concern. The new rationalism did not sweep all before it. In fact, it coexisted with a revival of sentimentalism and emotionalism. Until about 1750, Baroque art and music glorified religious feeling in drama as well as the grandiose pretensions of absolute monarch. During the French Revolution, Romanticism and nationalism implicitly challenged what some saw as Enlightenment's overemphasis on reason. The counter-Enlightenment views laid the foundation for new cultural and political values in the 19th century. Overall, intellectual and cultural developments during this period marked a transition in European history to a modern worldview in which rationalism, skepticism, scientific investigation, and belief in progress generally dominated, although such views did not completely overwhelm other worldviews stemming from religion, nationalism, and romanticism. Rational and empirical thought challenged traditional values and ideas. Intellectuals such as Voltaire and Diderot began to apply principles of the scientific revolution to society and human institutions, including Montesquieu's Spirit of Laws and Beccaria's On Crimes and Punishments. Locke and Rousseau developed new political models based on the concept of natural rights. Despite the principles of equality espoused by the Enlightenment and French Revolution, intellectuals such as Rousseau offered new arguments for the exclusion of women from political life, which did not go unchallenged by Mary Wollstonecraft, Olympe de Gouges, and the Marquis de Condorcet. Rational empirical thought challenged traditional values and ideas, including new public venues and print media popularized Enlightenment ideas. A variety of institutions such as salons explored and disseminated Enlightenment culture, such as coffee houses, academies, lending libraries, and Masonic lodges. Despite censorship, increasingly numerous and varied printed materials served a growing literate public and led to the development of public opinion, including newspapers, periodicals, books, pamphlets, and the encyclopedia. Natural sciences, literature, and popular culture increasingly exposed Europeans to representations of peoples outside of Europe. New political and economic theories challenged absolutism and mercantilism. Political theories such as John Locke's conceived a society as composed of individuals driven by self-interest and argued that the state originated in the consent of the governed, i.e. a social contract, rather than divine right or tradition. Mercantilist theory and practices were challenged by new economic ideas such as Adam Smith espousing a free trade and free market, seen in physiocrats Francois Quesnay and Anne Robert Jacques Turgot. Intellectuals including Voltaire and Diderot developed new philosophies of deism, skepticism, and atheism, including David Hume and Baron d'Holbach. Religion was viewed increasingly as a matter of private rather than public concern. By 1800, most governments had extended toleration to Christian minorities and in some states civil equality to Jews. The arts moved from the celebration of religious themes and royal power to an emphasis on private life and public good. Until about 1750, Baroque art and music promoted religious feeling, and that was employed by monarchs to glorify the state power, seen with Velázquez, Bernini, Handel, and Bach. Artistic movements and literature also reflected the outlook and values of commercial and bourgeois society, as well as new Enlightenment ideals of political power and citizenship, seen in Dutch painting, Frans Hals, Rembrandt, Jan Vermeer, Neoclassicism, Jacques-Louis David, and the Pantheon in Paris, and also in Daniel Defoe, Samuel Richardson, Henry Fielding, Wolfgang von Goethe, and Jane Austen. While Enlightenment values dominated the world and European ideas that were challenged by a revival of public sentiment and feeling, Rousseau questioned the exclusive reliance on reason and emphasized the role of emotions in the moral improvement of self and society. Revolution, war, and rebellion demonstrated the emotional power of mass politics and nationalism, and Romanticism emerged as a challenge to the Enlightenment rationality. Key Concept 2.4. The experiences of everyday life were shaped by demographic, environmental, medical, and technological changes. The legacies of the 16th century population explosion, which roughly doubled the European population, were social disruptions and demographic disasters that persisted in the 18th century. Volatile weather in the 17th century harmed agricultural production. In some localities, recurring food shortages caused undernourishment that combined with disease to produce periodic spikes in mortality. By the 17th century, European marriage pattern, which limited family size, became the most important check on population levels, although some couples also adopted birth control practices to limit family size. By the middle of the 18th century, better weather, improvements in transportation, new crops, and agricultural practices, less epidemic disease, and advances in medicine and hygiene allowed much of Europe to escape from the cycle of famines that had caused repeated demographic disaster. By the end of the 18th century, reductions in child mortality and increases in life expectancy constituted the demographic underpinnings of new attitudes towards children and families, particularly in Western Europe. The demographic revolution, along with the rise in prosperity, produced advances in material well-being that did not stop the economic. Greater prosperity was associated with increasing literacy, education, and rich cultural lives, the growth of publishing in libraries, the founding of schools, and the establishment of orchestras, theaters, and museums. By the end of the 18th century, it was evident that a higher proportion of Europeans were better fed, healthier, longer lived, and more secure and comfortable in their material well-being than in any previous time in human history. This relative prosperity was balanced by increasing numbers of poor throughout Europe, who strained charitable resources and alarmed government officials and local communities. In the 17th century, small landholding, low productivity agricultural practices, poor transportation, and adverse weather limited and disrupted food supply, causing periodic famines. By the 18th century, Europeans began to escape from the Malthusian imbalance between population and food supply, resulting in steady population growth. By the middle of the 18th century, higher agricultural productivity and improved transportation increased the food supply, allowing populations to grow and reducing the number of demographic crises, a process known as the Agricultural Revolution. In the 18th century, plague disappeared as a major epidemic disease, and inoculation reduced smallpox mortality. The consumer revolution of the 18th century was shaped by a new concern for privacy, encouraged the purchase of new goods and homes, and created new venues for leisure activities, including homes built to include private retreats such as a boudoir. Novels encouraged a reflection of private emotion. Porcelain dishes, cotton linens and home decor, mirrors and prints, coffee houses, taverns, theaters, and opera houses. By the 18th century, family and private life reflected new demographic patterns and effects of the commercial revolution. Although the rate of illegitimate births increased in the 18th century, population growth was limited by the European marriage pattern and in some areas by the early practice of birth control. As infant and child mortality decreased, the commercial wealth increased and families dedicated more space and resources to children and child rearing as well as private life and comfort. Cities offered economic opportunities which attracted increasing migration from rural areas, transforming urban life and creating challenges for the new urbanities and their families. The agricultural revolution produced more food using fewer workers, and as a result, people migrated from rural areas to cities in search of work. The growth of cities eroded traditional communal values, and city governments strained to provide protection and healthy environment. The concentration of the poor in cities led to a greater awareness of poverty, crime, and prostitution as social problems, and prompted increased efforts to police marginal groups. Key Concept 3.1. The Industrial Revolution spread from Great Britain to the continent, where the state played a greater role in promoting industry. The transition from an agricultural to an industrial economy began in Britain in the 18th century, spread to France and Germany between 1850 and 1870, and finally spread to Russia in the 1890s. The government of these countries actively supported industrialization. In southern and eastern Europe, some pockets of an industry developed surrounded by traditional agrarian economies, although continental nations sought to borrow from and in some instances imitate the British model, the success of which was represented by the Crystal Palace exhibition in 1851. Each nation's experience of industrialization was shaped by its own matrix of geographic, social, and political factors. The legacy of the revolution in France, for example, led to a more gradual adoption of mechanization in productions, ensuring a more incremental industrialization than was the case in Britain. Despite the creation of customs union in the 1830s, Germany's lack of political unity hindered its industrial development. However, following unification in 1871, the German Empire quickly came to challenge British dominance in its key industries such as steel, coal, and chemicals. Beginning in the 1870s, the European economy fluctuated wildly because of the vagaries of financial markets. Continental states responded by assisting and protecting the development of national identity in a variety of ways, the most important being protective tariffs, military procurement, and colonial conquest. Key economic stakeholders, such as corporations and industrialists, expected governments to promote economic development by subsidizing ports, transportation, and new inventions, registering patents and sponsoring education, encouraging investment, and enforcing contracts and maintaining order and preventing labor strikes. State intervention reached its culmination in the 20th century, when some governments took over direction of the entire process of industrial development under the pressure of war and depression, or from ideological commitments. Great Britain established its industrial dominance through the mechanization of textile production, iron and steel production, and new transportation systems. Britain's ready supply of coal, iron ore, and other essential raw materials promoted industrial growth. Economic institutions and human capital, such as engineers, inventors, and capitalists, helped Britain lead the process of industrialization, largely through private initiative. The Crystal Palace Great Exposition of 1851, banks, and government financial awards to inventors are examples of this. Britain's parliamentary government promoted commercial and industrial interests because those interests were represented in Parliament. Following the British example, industrialization took root in continental Europe, sometimes with state sponsorship. France moves towards industrialization at a more gradual pace than Great Britain, with a government support with less dislocation in traditional methods of production, including canals, railroads, and trade agreements. Industrialization in Prussia allowed the state to become a leader of a unified Germany, which subsequently underwent rapid industrialization under government sponsorship, seen with the Zollverein investment in transportation networks, adoption of improved methods of manufacturing, and Friedrich List's national system. A combination of factors, including geography, lack of resources, the dominance of traditional landed elites, and the persistence of serfdom in some areas, and inadequate government sponsorship, accounted for Eastern and Southern Europe's lag in industrial development, seen with the lack of resources and the lack of adequate transportation. During the Second Industrial Revolution, from 1870 to 1914, more areas of Europe experienced industrial activity and industrial processes increased in scale and complexity. Mechanization of the factory system became the predominant model of modes of production by 1914. New technologies and means of communication and transportation, including railroads, resulted in more fully integrated national economies, a higher level of urbanization, and a truly global network of exchange, including the Bessemer process, mass production, electricity, chemicals, telegraphs, steamships, streetcars and trolley cars, telephones, internal combustion engines, airplane, and radio. Volatile business cycles in the last quarter of the 19th century led corporations and governments to try to manage the market through monopolies, banking practices, and tariffs. During the Second Industrial Revolution, 1870-1914, more areas of Europe experienced industrial activity, and industrial processes increased in scale and complexity. Key Concept 3.2. The experiences of everyday life were shaped by industrialization, depending on the level of industrial development in a particular location. Industrialization promoted the development of new socioeconomic classes between 1815 and 1914. In highly industrialized areas such as Western and Northern Europe, the new economy created new social divisions, leading for the first time to the development of self-conscious economic classes, especially the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. In addition, economic changes led to the rise of trade and industrial unions, benevolent associations, sports clubs, and distinctive class-based cultures of dress, speech, values, and customs. Europe also experienced rapid population growth and urbanization that resulted in benefits as well as social dislocations. The increased populations created a large labor force, but in some areas, migration from the countryside to the towns and cities led to overcrowding and significant immigration overseas. Industrialization and urbanization changed the structure and relations of bourgeois and working class families to varying degrees. Birth control became increasingly common across Europe, and childhood experiences changed with the advent of protective legislation, universal schooling, and smaller families. The growth of the cult of domesticity established new models of gendered behavior for men and women. Gender roles became more clearly defined as middle-class women withdrew from the workforce, and at the same time working-class women increased their participation as wage laborers, although the middle class criticized them for neglecting their families. Industrialization and urbanization also changed people's conception of time. In particular, work and leisure were increasingly differentiated by means of imposition of strict work schedules and the separation of the workplace from the home. Increasingly, trade unions assumed responsibility for the social welfare of working-class families, fighting for improved working conditions and shorter hours. Increasingly, leisure time spurred the development of leisure activities and spaces for bourgeois families. Overall, although inequality and poverty remained significant social problems, the quality of material life improved. For most social groups, the standard of living rose, and the availability of consumer products grew, and sanitary standards, medical practice, and life expectancy improved. Industrialization promoted the development of new classes in industrial regions of Europe. In industrialized areas of Europe, Western and Northern Europe, socioeconomic changes created divisions of labor that led to the development of self-conscious classes such as the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. In some of these less industrialized areas of Europe, the dominance of agricultural elites persisted in the 20th century. Class identity developed and was reinforced through participation in philanthropic, political, and social associations among the middle classes, and in mutual aid societies and trade unions among the working classes. Europe experienced rapid population growth and urbanization leading to social dislocation. Along with better harvests, caused in part by commercialization of agriculture, industrialization promoted population growth, longer life expectancy, and lowered infant mortality. With migration from rural areas to urban areas in industrialized regions, cities experienced overcrowding, while affected rural areas suffered declines in available labor as well as weakened communities. Over time, the Industrial Revolution altered the family structure and relations for bourgeois and working class families. Bourgeois families became focused on the nuclear family and the cult of domesticity, with the distinct gender roles for women and men. By the end of the century, wages and the quality of life of the working class improved because of the laws restricting the labor of children and women. Social welfare programs improved diet and the use of birth control. These included the Factory Act of 1833, Mines Act of 1842, and the 10 Hours Act of 1847. Economic motivations for marriage, while still important for all classes, diminished as the middle-class notion of companionship marriage began to be adopted by the working classes. Leisure time centered increasingly on the family or small groups, concurrent with the development or activities of spaces that use time. These include parks, sports clubs, arenas, beaches, department stores, museums, theaters, and opera houses. A heightened consumerism developed as a result of the Second Industrial Revolution. Industrialization and mass marketing increased both the production and demand for a new range of consumer goods, including clothing, processed foods, labor-saving devices, and created more leisure opportunities, including advertising, department stores, and catalogs. New efficient methods of transportation and other innovations created new industries, improved the distribution of goods, increased consumerism, and enhanced the quality of life. These included steamships, railroads, refrigerated rail cars, ice boxes, streetcars, bicycles. including the chemical industry, electricity and utilities, automobile, leisure activity, and professional and leisure sports. Because of the persistence of primitive agricultural practices and land-owning patterns, some areas of Europe lagged in industrialization while facing famine, debt, and land shortages, including the Hungry 40s, the Irish potato famine, and Russian serfdom. Key Concept 3.3. The problems of industrialization provoked a range of ideological, governmental, and collective responses. The French and Industrial Revolutions triggered dramatic political and social consequences and new theories to deal with them. The ideologies engendered by these 19th century revolutions, conservatism, liberalism, socialism, nationalism, and even romanticism, provided their adherents with coherent views of the world and differing blueprints for change. For example, utopian socialists experimented with communal living as a social and economic response to change. The responses to socioeconomic challenges reached a culmination in the revolutions of 1848. By the failure of these uprisings left the issues raised by the economic, political, and social transformations unresolved well into the 20th century. In the second half of the 19th century, labor leaders in many countries created unions and syndicates to provide the working classes with a collective voice, and these organizations used collective action such as strikes and movements for men's universal suffrage to reinforce their demands. Feminists and suffragettes petitioned and staged protests to press their demands for similar rights for women. The international movements for socialism, labor, and women's rights were important examples of a trend towards international cooperation in a variety of causes, including anti-slavery and peace movements. Finally, political parties emerged as sophisticated vehicles for advocating reform and reacting to changing conditions in the political arena. Nationalism acted as one of the most powerful engines of political change, inspiring revolutions as well as campaigns by states for national unity or higher degree of centralization. Early nationalism emphasized shared historical and cultural experiences that often threatened traditional elites. Over the course of the 19th century, leaders recognized the need to promote national unity through economic development and expanding state functions to meet challenges posed by industry. Ideologies developed and took root throughout society as a response to industrial political revolutions. Liberals emphasized popular sovereignty, individual rights, and enlightened self-interest, but debated the extent to which all these groups in society should actively participate in governance, including Jeremy Bentham, anti-corn law leagues, and John Stuart Mill. Radicals in Britain and Republicans on the continent demanded universal male suffrage and full citizenship without regard to wealth and property of ownership. Some argued that such rights should be extended to women, including Chartists and Flora Tristan. Conservatives developed a new ideology in support of traditional political and religious authorities, which was based on the idea of human nature was not perfectible, including Edmund Burke, Joseph Maistre, and Clemens von Metternich. Socialists called for a fair distribution of society's resources and wealth and evolved from a utopian to a Marxist scientific critique of capitalism, including Henri de Saint-Simon, Charles Fourier, Robert Owen, Friedrich Engels, August Bebel, Clara Zetkin, and Rosa Luxemburg. Anarchists asserted that all forms of government authority were unnecessary and should be overthrown and replaced by a society based on voluntary cooperation, including Mikhail Bakunin and George Sorel. Ideologies developed and took root through society as a response to industrial and political revolutions. Nationalists encouraged loyalty to the nation in a variety of ways, including romantic idealism, liberal reform, political unification, radicalism with a concomitant anti-Semitism, and chauvinism justifying national aggrandizement, including J.G. Fichte, Grimm Brothers, Giuseppe Mazzini, and Pan-Slavis. Also the Dreyfus Affair, Christian Social Party in Germany, and Karl Lueger, the mayor of Vienna. A form of Jewish nationalism, Zionism, developed in the late 19th century as a response to the growing anti-Semitism in both Western and Eastern Europe. This is seen in Theodor Herzl. Governments responded to the problem created and exacerbated by industrialization by expanding their functions and creating modern bureaucratic states. Liberalism shifted from laissez-faire to interventionist economic and social policies on behalf of the less privileged. The policies were based on a rational approach to reform that addressed the impact of the Industrial Revolution on the individual. Government reform transformed unhealthy and overcrowded cities by modernizing infrastructure, regulating public health, reforming prisons, and establishing modern police forces, including the sewage and water systems, public lighting, public housing, urban redesign, parks, and public transportation. Governments promoted compulsory public education to advance the goals of public order, nationalism, and economic growth. Political movements and social organizations responded to the problems of industrialization. Mass-based political parties emerged as sophisticated vehicles for social and economic and political reform, including conservatives and liberals in Great Britain, conservatives and socialists in France, and the Social Democratic Party in Germany. Workers established labor unions and movements promoting social and economic reform that also developed into political parties, including the German Social Democratic Party, British Labour Party, and the Russian Social Democratic Party. Feminists pressed for legal and economic and political rights for women as well as improved working conditions, seen with Flora Tristan, British Women's Social and Political Union, Pankhurst Family, and the Barbara Smith Bowditch-on. Various private non-governmental reform movements sought to lift up the deserving poor and end serfdom and slavery, including the Sunday School movement, the temperance movement, the British abolitionist movement, Josephine Butler, also seen with the young prostitutes, children, women, and elderly. Key Concept 3.4 European states struggled to maintain international stability in an age of nationalism and revolution. Following a quarter century of revolutionary upheaval and war spurred by Napoleon's imperial ambitions, the great powers met in Vienna in 1814 and 15 to re-establish a workable balance of power and suppress liberal and nationalist movements for change. Austrian Foreign Minister Clement von Metternich led to the new ways in creating an informal security arrangement to resolve international disputes and stem revolution through common action among the great powers. Nonetheless, revolutions aimed at liberalization of the political system and national self-determination defined in the period from 1815 to 1848. The revolutions that swept Europe in 1848 were triggered by poor economic conditions, frustration at a slow pace of political change, and unfulfilled nationalistic aspirations. At first, revolutionary forces succeeded in establishing regimes dedicated to change or to gaining independence from great power domination. However, conservative forces, which still controlled the military and bureaucracy, reasserted control. Although the revolutions of 1848 were, as George Macaulay Taberlin quipped, a turning point at which modern history failed to turn, they set the stage of subsequent sea change in European diplomacy. A new breed of conservative leader, exemplified by Napoleon III of France, co-opted nationalism as a top-down force for the advancement of state power and authoritarian rule in the name of the people. Further, the Crimean War of 1853-56 prompted a decline of the Ottoman Empire and shattered the concert of Europe, established in 1815, and opened the door for the unification of Italy and Germany. Using the methods of realpolitik, Cavour in Italy and Bismarck in Germany succeeded in unifying their nations after centuries of disunity. Their policies of war, diplomatic intrigue, and in Bismarck's instance, manipulation of demographic mechanisms, created states with the potential for upsetting the balance of power, particularly in this case of Germany. Following the Crimean War, Russia undertook a series of internal reforms aimed at achieving industrial modernization. The reforms succeeded in establishing an industrial economy and emboldened Russia's aspirations in the Balkans. They also led to an active revolutionary government which employed political violence and assassinations as one of the driving forces behind the 1905 Russian Revolution. After the new Russian Emperor Wilhelm II dismissed Chancellor Bismarck in 1890, Germany's diplomatic approach altered significantly, leading to a shift in the alliance system and increased tensions in Europe diplomacy. Imperial antagonisms, growing nationalism, militarism, and other factors resulted in the development of a rigid system of alliances. The great powers militarized their societies and built up army and naval forces to unprecedented levels, fed by industrial and technological advances, while at some time developing elaborate plans for the next war. The long-anticipated war finally came in the summer of 1914. The assassination of the heir to the Austrian throne in Sarajevo forced political leaders and the great powers locked in the rigid structure of the Triple Entente versus the Triple Alliance to implement war plans that virtually required the escalation of hostilities. The ensuing Great War revealed the flaws of the diplomatic order, established the unification of Germany and Italy, but more important, it produced even more challenging diplomatic situations that faced the diplomats in 1814 and 15. The Concert of Europe, or Congress system, sought to maintain the status quo through collective action and adherence to conservatism. Seen with Metternich's Architects of Concert Europe, used it to suppress nationalist and liberal revolutions. Conservatives re-established control in many European states and attempted to suppress movements for change, and in some areas to strengthen adherence to religious authorities. In the first half of the 19th century, revolutionaries attempted to destroy the status quo, seen with the Greek War for Independence, December's revolt in Russia, Polish rebellion, and the July Revolution in France. The revolutions of 1848 challenged the conservative order and led to a breakdown of the concert of Europe. The breakdown of the concert of Europe opened the door for movements of national unification in Italy and Germany, as well as liberal reforms elsewhere. The Crimean War demonstrated the weakness of the Ottoman Empire and contributed to the breakdown of the concert of Europe, thereby creating the conditions in which Italy and Germany could be unified under centuries of fragmentation. A new breed of conservative leaders, including Napoleon III, Cavour, and Bismarck, co-opted the agenda of nationalists for the purpose of creating and strengthening the state. The creation of the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary, which recognized the political power of the largest ethnic minority, was an attempt to stabilize the state by reconfiguring national unity. In Russia, autocratic leaders pushed through a program of reform and modernization, which gave rise to revolutionary movements and eventually the Revolution of 1905, including Alexander II, Sergei Witte, and Peter Stolypin. The unification of Italy and Germany transformed the European balance of power and led to efforts to construct a new diplomatic order. Seen with Cavour's realpolitik strategies combined with popular Garibaldi's military campaigns led to the unification of Italy. Bismarck employed diplomacy and industrialized warfare and weaponry and the manipulation of democratic mechanisms to unify Germany. After 1871, Bismarck attempted to maintain the balance of power through a complex system of alliances directed at isolating France, seen with the Three Emperors League, Triple Alliance, and reassurance treaties. Bismarck's dismissal in 1890 eventually led to a system of mutually antagonistic alliances and heightened international tensions. National tensions in the Balkans drew the great powers into a series of crises leading up to World War I. With the Congress of Berlin in 1878, growing influence of Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina annexation, First Balkan War, and the Second Balkan War. Key Concept 3.5. A variety of motives and methods led to the intensification of European global control and increased tensions among great powers. The European imperial outreach in the 19th century was in some ways a continuation of 3 centuries of colonization, but it also resulted from the economic pressure and necessities of a maturing industrial economy. The new technologies and imperatives of the Second Industrial Revolution, 1870 to 1914, led many European nations to view overseas territories as sources of raw materials and consumer markets. While European colonial empires in the Western Hemisphere diminished in size over this period as former colonies gained independence, the region maintained dependent on Europe as a source of capital and technological expertise and was a market for European-made goods. European powers also became increasingly dominant in Eastern and Southern Asia in the early 19th century, and a combination of forces created the conditions of a new wave of imperialism there and in Africa later in the century. Moreover, European national rivalries accelerated the expansion of colonialism as government recognized the actual control of these societies offered economic and strategic advantages. Notions of global destiny and racial superiority fed the drive for empire and innovation, such as anti-malarial drugs, machine guns, gunboats made it feasible. Non-European societies without these modern advantages could not effectively resist European imperial momentum. The new imperialism of the late 19th and early 20th century was promoted in European nations by interest groups that included politicians, military officials, soldiers, missionaries, explorers, journalists, and intellectuals. As an example of a new complex phase of imperial diplomacy, the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 outlined the procedures that Europeans would use to partition the African continent. By 1914, most of Africa and Asia were under the domination of Great Britain, France, Portugal, Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Notwithstanding the power of colonial administration, some groups in the colonial societies resisted European imperialism, and by 1914, anti-colonial movements had taken root within the non-European world and in Europe itself. Imperialism exposed Europeans to foreign societies and introduced exotic influences into European art and culture. At the same time, millions of Europeans carried their cultures abroad to the Americas and elsewhere, through immigration and to help create a variety of mixed cultures around the world. European nations were driven by economic, political, and cultural motivations and their new imperial ventures in Asia and Africa. European national rivalries and strategic concerns fostered imperial expansion and competition for colonies, the search for new materials and markets for manufactured goods, as well as strategic and nationalist considerations drove Europeans to colonize Africa and Asia, even as European colonies in the Americas broke free politically, if not economically. Europeans justified imperialism through an ideology of cultural and racial superiority. Industrial and technological developments, the Second Industrial Revolution, facilitated European control of the global empires. The development of advanced weaponry invariably ensured the military superiority of Europeans over colonized areas, including the mini-ball, breech-loading rifle, and machine gun. Communication and transportation technologies allowed for the creation of European empires. Advances in medicine supported European control of Africa and Asia by preserving European lives, including Louis Pasteur's germ theory of disease, anesthesia, antiseptics, public health projects, and quinine. Imperial endeavors significantly affected society, diplomacy, and culture in Europe and created resistance to foreign control abroad. Imperialism created diplomatic tensions among European states, a strained alliance system. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, the Fashoda Crisis of 1898, and the Moroccan Crisis of 1905 and 1911. Imperial encounters with non-European peoples influenced the styles and subject matter of artists and writers and provoked debates over the acquisition of colonies. This is seen in Jules Verne's literature of exploration, Paul Gauguin and Pablo Picasso's primitivism, Vincent van Gogh and Japanese Prince, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, Pan-German League, and J.A. Hobson and Vladimir Lenin's anti-imperialism. As non-Europeans became educated in Western values, they challenged European imperialism through nationalistic movements and or by modernizing their own economies and societies. Seen with the Indian Congress Party, Zulu resistance, India's Sepoy Mutiny, China's Boxer Rebellion, and Japan's Meiji Restoration. Key Concept 3.6. European ideas and cultures expressed a tension between objectivity and scientific realism on one hand, and subjectivity and individual expression on the other. The Romantic movement of the early 19th century set up the stage for later cultural perspectives by encouraging individuals to cultivate their uniqueness and to trust in intuition and emotion as much as reason. Partly in reaction to the Enlightenment, Romanticism affirmed the value of sensitivity, imagination, and creativity, and thereby provided a climate for artistic experimentation. Later artistic movements such as Impressionism, Expressionism, and Cubism, which rested on subjective interpretations of reality by the individual artist or writer, arose from the attitudes fostered by Romanticism. The sensitivity of artists to non-European traditions that imperialism brought to their attention also can be traced to the Romantics' emphasis on the primacy of culture in defining the character of individuals and groups. In science, Darwin's evolutionary theory raised questions about human nature, and physicists began to challenge the uniformity and regularity of Newtonian universe. In 1905, Einstein's theory of relativity underscored the position of the observer in defining reality, while the quantum mechanics principles of randomness and probability called the objectivity of Newtonian mechanics into question. The emergence of psychology as an independent discipline, separate from philosophy on one hand and neurology on the other, led to investigations of human behavior that gradually revealed the need for more subtle methods of analysis than those provided by the physical and biological sciences. Freud's investigations into the human psyche suggested the power of irrational motivations and unconscious drives. Many writers saw humans as governed by spontaneous, irrational forces and believed that intuition and will were as important as reason in science in the search for truth. In art, literature, and science, traditional notions of objective universe, truths, and values increasingly shared the stage with a commitment and recognition of subjectivity, skepticism, and cultural relativism. Romanticism broke with neoclassical forms of artistic representation and with rationalism, placing more emphasis on intuition and emotion. Romantic artists and composers broke from classical artistic forms to emphasize emotion, nature, individuality, institutions, supernatural, and national histories in their works. These included Francisco Goya, Caspar David Friedrich, J.M.W. Turner, John Constable, and Eugene Delacroix. Also Ludwig van Beethoven, Frédéric Chopin, Richard Wagner, and Tchaikovsky. Romantic writers expressed similar themes while responding to the Industrial Revolution and to various political revolutions, including Wolfgang von Goethe, William Wordsworth, Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, John Keats, Mary Shelley, and Victor Hugo. Following the revolutions of 1848, Europe turned towards a realist and materialist worldview. Positivism or the philosophy that science alone provides knowledge, emphasized the rational and scientific analysis of nature and human affairs. Charles Darwin provided a rational and material account of biological change and the development of human beings as a species, and inadvertently a justification for racialist theories known as social Darwinism. Marxist scientific socialism provided a systematic critique of capitalism and deterministic analysis of society and historical evolution. Realist and materialistic themes and attitudes influenced art and literature as painters and writers depicted the lives of ordinary people and drew attention to social problems, including Balzac, Duhamel, Dickens, Eliot, Courbet, Dostoevsky, Millet, Tolstoy, Zola, and Hardy. A new relativism in values and loss of confidence in the objectivity of knowledge led to a modernism in intellectual and cultural life. Philosophy largely moved from rational interpretations of nature and human society to an emphasis on irrationality and impulse, a view that contributed to the belief that conflict and struggle led to progress. Friedrich Nietzsche's George Sorel and Henri Bergson. Freudian psychology provided a new account of human nature that emphasized the role of the irrational and the struggle between the conscious and subconscious. Developments in the natural sciences, such as quantum mechanics and Einstein's theory of relativity, undermined the primacy of Newtonian physics as an objective description of nature, including Max Planck and Marie and Pierre Curie. Modern art, including Impressionism, Post-Impressionism, and Cubism, moved beyond the representational to the subjective and abstract and expressive, and often provoked audiences that believed that art should reflect shared and idealized values such as beauty and patriotism, including Claude Monet, Paul Cézanne, Henri Matisse, Edgar Degas, Pablo Picasso, and Vincent van Gogh. Key Concept 4.1 Total war and political instability in the first half of the 20th century gave way to polarized state order during the Cold War and eventually to efforts at transnational union. European politics and diplomacy in the 20th century were defined by total war and its consequences. World War I destroyed the balance of power, and the Treaty of Versailles, which ended the war, created unstable conditions in which extremist ideologies emerged that challenged liberal democracy and the post-war settlement. In Russia, hardships during World War I gave rise to revolution in 1917. The newly established post-war democracies in Central and Eastern Europe were too weak to provide stability either internally or in European state system, especially during the Great Depressions of the 1930s. The League of Nations, established after the war to employ collective security in the interest of peace, could not manage the international tensions unleashed by World War I. The breakdown of the settlement led to World War II, a conflict even more violent than World War I. During this Second Great War, the combatants engaged in wholesale destruction of cities, deliberate attacks on civilians, and the systematic destruction of their enemies' industrial complexes. The Nazi government in Germany undertook the annihilation of Jews from the whole continent, the Holocaust, as well as the murder of other targeted groups of Europeans. At the end of the war, the economic and political devastation left a power vacuum that facilitated the Cold War division of Europe. During the 20th century, European imperialism, power, and sense of superiority reached both its apogee and nadir. In the first half of the century, nations extended their control and influence over most of the non-Western world, often through the League of Nations mandates. The idea of decolonization was born early in the century with the formation of movements seeking rights for indigenous people. The material and moral destruction of World War II made the idea a reality. After the war, regions colonized and dominated by European nations moved from resistance to independence at different rates and with differing consequences. Yet even after decolonization, neocolonial dependency persisted, and millions of people migrated to Europe and its economy recovered from the war. This immigration created large populations of poor and isolated minorities, which occasionally rioted because of discrimination and economic deprivation. As European governments tried to solve these problems, the apparently permanent presence of the immigrants challenged old notions of European identity. The uneasy alliance between Soviet Russia and the West during World War II gave way after 1945 to a diplomatic, political, and economic confrontation between the democratic capitalist states of Western Europe, allied with the United States, and the Communist bloc of Eastern Europe dominated by the Soviet Union, also known as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR. During the ensuing confrontation between East and West, called the Cold War, relations between the two blocs fluctuated, but one consequence of the conflict was that European nations could not act autonomously in international affairs. The superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States, controlled international relations in Europe. Nonetheless, the Cold War promoted political and economic unity in Western Europe, leading to the establishment of a succession of ever more comprehensive organizations for economic cooperation. In 1957, 6 countries formed the Common Market, which soon began to expand its membership to include other European states. The success of the Common Market inspired Europeans to work towards a closer political and economic unity, including a European executive body and parliament. The founding of the European Union in 1991 at Maastricht included the agreement to establish the euro as a common currency for qualifying member states. Following a series of largely peaceful revolutions in 1989, culminating in the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the formerly communist states of Eastern Europe moved towards democracy and capitalist economies, and over time some of these states joined the European Union. One unforeseen consequence of the end of the Cold War was the reemergence of nationalist movements within states, which led to the Balkan Wars in Yugoslavia and tensions among the successor states of the Soviet Union, as well as the rebirth of the nationalist political parties in Western Europe. World War I, caused by a complex interaction of long and short-term factors, resulted in immense losses and disruptions by both victors and vanquished. A variety of factors, including nationalism, military plans, the alliance system, and imperial competition, turned a regional dispute in the Balkans into a World War I. New technologies confounded traditional military strategies and led to massive troop losses, including the machine gun, barbed wire, submarine, airplane, poison gas, and tank. The effects of military stalemate and total war led to protests and insurrection in the belligerent nations and eventually to revolutions that changed the international balance of power. The war in Europe quickly spread to non-European theaters, transforming the war into a global conflict, including the Armenian genocide, Arab revolt against the Turks, Japanese aggression in the Pacific, and on the Chinese mainland. The relationship of Europe to the world shifted significantly with the globalization of the conflict, the emergence of the United States as a world power, and the overthrow of European empires. The conflicting goals of the peace negotiators in Paris pitted diplomatic idealism against the desire to punish Germany, producing a settlement that satisfied few. Wilsonian idealism clashed with post-war realities in both the victorious and defeated states. Democratic successor states emerged from former empires and eventually succumbed to significant political, economic, and diplomatic crises. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Yugoslavia being examples of these. The League of Nations, created to prevent future wars, was weakened from the outset by the non-participation of major powers, including the United States, Germany, and the Soviet Union. The Versailles Settlement, particularly its provisions on the assignment of guilt and reparations for the war, hindered the German Weimar Republic abilities to establish a stable and legitimate political and economic system. In the interwar period, fascism, extreme nationalism, racist ideologies, and the failure of appeasement resulted in the catastrophe of World War II, presenting a grave challenge to European civilization. French and British fears of another war, American isolationism, and distrust between Western democratic capitalist nations and the Communist Soviet Union allowed fascist states to rearm and expand their territory. This includes the remilitarization of the Rhineland, Italian invasion of Ethiopia, annexation of Austria, Munich Agreement and its violation, and the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. German blitzkrieg warfare in Europe combined with Japan's attacks in Asia and the Pacific brought the Axis powers early victories. American and British industrial, scientific, and technological power and the all-out military commitment of the USSR contributed critically to the Allies' victories. Fueled by racism and anti-Semitism, Nazi Germany, with the cooperation of some of the other Axis powers and collaboration as governments, sought to establish a new racial order in Europe, which culminated with the Holocaust. This includes the Nuremberg Laws, Wannsee Conference, and Auschwitz and other death camps. As World War II ended, a Cold War between the liberal democratic West and the communist East began, lasting nearly half a century. Despite efforts to maintain international cooperation through the newly created United Nations, deeply seated tensions between the USSR and West led to the division of Europe, which was referred to as the West as the Iron Curtain. The Cold War played out on a global stage and involved propaganda campaigns, covert actions, limited hot wars in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and an arms race with the threat of nuclear war. These include the Korean War, Vietnam War, Yom Kippur War, and Afghanistan War. The United States exerted a strong military, political, and economic influence in Western Europe, leading to the creation of world monetary and trade systems and geopolitical alliances such as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. This also includes the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and the World Trade Organization. Countries east of the Iron Curtain came under the military, political, and economic domination of the Soviet Union within the Council of Mutual Economic Assistance, Comecon, and the Warsaw Pact. The collapse of the USSR in 1991 ended the Cold War and led to the establishment of capitalist economies throughout Eastern Europe. Germany was reunited, the Czechs and Slovaks parted, Yugoslavia dissolved, and the European Union was enlarged through admission of former Eastern Bloc countries. In response to the destructive impact of two world wars, European nations began to set aside nationalism in favor of economic and political integration, forming a series of transnational unions that grew in size and scope over the second half of the 20th century. As the economic alliance known as the European Coal and Steel Community envisioned as a means to spur post-war economic recovery, developed in the European Economic Community, or EEC, or Common Market, and the European Union, EU, Europe experienced increasing economic and political integration and efforts to establish a shared European identity. One of the major and continuing challenges to countries in the EU is balancing national sovereignty with the responsibilities of membership in an economic and political union, including the creation of the euro, the creation of the European Parliament, and free movement across borders. Nationalist and separatist movements, along with ethnic conflict and ethnic cleansing, periodically disrupted the post-World War II peace. This includes examples of Ireland, Chechnya, Basque, Flemish, Bosnian Muslims, and Albanian Muslims of Kosovo. The process of decolonization occurred over the course of the century with varying degrees of cooperation, interference, and resistance from European imperialist states. At the end of World War I, President Woodrow Wilson's principle of national self-determination raised expectations in the non-European world for freedom from colonial domination, expectations that led to international instability. The League of Nations distributed former German and Ottoman possessions to France and Great Britain through the Mandate system, thereby altering the imperial balance of power and creating a strategic interest in the Middle East and its oil, including Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Palestine. Despite indigenous nationalist movements, independence from many African and Asian territories was delayed until the mid and even late 20th century by the imperialist powers' reluctance to relinquish control, threats of interference from other nations, unstable economic and political systems, and the Cold War strategist alignments, including the Indian National Congress, Algeria's National Liberation Front, Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh, and Sukarno in Indonesia. Key Concept 4.2. The stresses of economic collapse and the total war engendered internal conflicts within European states and created conflicting conceptions of the relationship between the individual and the state, as demonstrated in the ideological battle between liberal democracy, communism, and fascism. During World War I, states increased the degree and scope of their authority over their economies, societies, and cultures. The demands of total war required the centralization of power and the regimentation of the lives of citizens. During the war, governments sought to control information and use propaganda to create stronger emotional ties to the nation in its war effort. Ironically, these measures also produced distrust of traditional authorities. At the end of the war, 4 empires dissolved: the German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian empires. But the democratic nations that arose in their place lacked a tradition of democratic policies and suffered from weak economies and ethnic tensions. Even before the end of the war, Russia experienced a revolution and civil war that created not only a new state, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, known as the USSR, but also a new conception of government and socioeconomic order based on communist ideals. In Italy and Germany, charismatic leaders led fascist movements to power, seizing control of post-World War I governments. Fascism promised to solve economic problems through state direction, although not ownership of production. The movements also promised to counteract the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles by rearming the military by territorial expansion. The efforts of fascist governments to revise the Treaty of Versailles led to the most violent and destructive war in human history, World War II, a conflict between liberal democracies temporarily allied with communist Russia and fascist states. When this conflict ended in the total defeat of fascism, Europe was devastated, and liberal capitalist democracies faced centrally directed communist states, the only viable alternative left. In the post-World War II period, despite the difference of ideology, states in both the West and East increased their involvement in citizens' life through the establishment of welfare programs, the expansion of education, regulation of planning of the economy, and the extension of cultural opportunities to all groups in society. With the collapse of communism and the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, the liberal democracies of Western Europe celebrated the triumph of their political and economic systems, and many former communist states moved for admission into the European Union and NATO. By the late 1990s, it became evident that the transition from communism to capitalism and democracy was not as simple as it first appeared. The West also experienced difficulties because of the economic recession and experienced both hybrid economies that emphasized the social responsibility of the state towards its citizens. The Russian Revolution created a regime based on Marxist-Leninist theory. In Russia, World War I exacerbated long-term problems of political stagnation, social inequality, incomplete industrialization, and food and land distribution, all while creating support for revolutionary change, including the February and March revolutions in the Petrograd Soviet. Military and worker insurrections aided by the revived Soviet undermined the provisional government and set the stage for Lenin's long-planned Bolshevik revolution and the establishment of a communist state. The Bolshevik takeover prompted a protracted civil war between communist forces and their opposition, who were aided by foreign powers. In order to improve economic performance, Lenin compromised with free market principles under the new economic policy, but after his death, Stalin undertook a centralized program of rapid economic modernization, including collectivization and the five-year plans. Stalin's economic modernization of the Soviet Union came at a high price, including the liquidation of the kulaks, famine in the Ukraine, purges of political rivals, unequal burdens placed on women, and the establishment of an oppressive political system, including the Great Purges, gulags, and secret police. The ideology of fascism with roots in pre-World War I era gained popularity in an environment of post-war bitterness, the rise of communism, uncertain transitions to democracy, and economic instability. Fascist dictatorships used modern technology and propaganda that rejected democratic institutions, promoted charismatic leaders, and glorified war and nationalism to lure the disillusioned. Mussolini and Hitler rose to power by exploiting post-war bitterness and economic instability, using terror and manipulating the fledgling and unpopular democracies in their countries. Franco's alliance with Italian and German fascists in the Spanish Civil War, in which the Western democracies did not intervene, represented a testing ground for World War II and resulted in authoritarian rule in Spain from 1936 to the mid-70s. After failure to establish functioning democracies, authoritarian dictatorships took power in Central and Eastern Europe during the interwar period, including Poland, Hungary, and Romania. The ideology of fascism The Great Depression, caused by weaknesses in international trade and monetary theories and practices, undermined Western European democracies and fomented radical political responses throughout Europe. World War I debt, nationalistic tariff policies, overproduction, depreciated currencies, disrupted trade, pattern speculation created weaknesses in economies worldwide. Dependence on post-World War I American investment capital led to financial collapse when following the 1929 stock market crash. The United States cut off capital flows to Europe. Despite attempts to rethink economic theories and policies and forge political alliances, Western democracies failed to overcome the Great Depression and were weakened by extremist movements, including Keynesian in Britain, cooperative social attention in Scandinavia, Popular Front policies in France, nationalist government in Britain, and Popular Fronts in France and Spain. Post-war economic growth supported an increase in welfare benefits. However, subsequent economic stagnation led to criticism and limitation of the welfare state. Marshall Plan funds from the United States financed an extensive reconstruction of industry and infrastructure and stimulated an extended period of growth in Western and Central Europe, often referred to as an economic miracle, which increased the economic and cultural importance of consumerism. The expansion of cradle-to-grave social welfare programs in the aftermath of World War II, accompanied by high taxes, became a contentious domestic policy issue on the budgets of European nations, came under pressure in the late 20th century. Eastern European nations were defined by their relationship with the Soviet Union, which oscillated between repression and limited reform, until Mikhail Gorbachev's policies that led to the collapse of the communist government in Eastern Europe and the fall of the Soviet Union. Central and Eastern European nations within the Soviet bloc followed an economic model based on central planning, extensive social welfare, and specialized production among bloc members. After 1956, Soviet leaders Nikita Khrushchev's de-Stalinization policies failed to meet their economic goals within the Soviet Union, and prompted revolts in Eastern Europe. Following a long period of economic stagnation, Mikhail Gorbachev's internal reforms of perestroika and glasnost, designed to make the Soviet system more flexible, failed to stave off the collapse of the Soviet Union and the hegemonic control over Eastern and Central European satellites. The rise of new nationalisms in Central and Eastern Europe brought peaceful revolutions in most countries, but resulted in war and genocide in the Balkans and instability in some former Soviet republics. Key Concept 4.3. During the 20th century, diverse intellectual and cultural movements questioned the existence of objective knowledge, the ability to reason to arrive at truth, and the role of religion in determining moral standards. The major trends of the 20th century European thought and culture moved from an optimistic view that modern science and technology could solve the problems of humankind to the formation of eclectic, sometimes skeptical movements that doubted the possibility of objective knowledge and of progress. Existentialism, postmodernism, and renewed religiosity challenged the perceived dogmatation of positivist science. While European society became increasingly secular, religion continued to play a role in the lives of many Europeans. Religious denominations addressed and in some cases incorporated modern ideas such as toleration of other religions as well as scholarship, biblical and scientific, that challenged the veracity of the Bible. Christian churches made these accommodations as immigration, particularly from Muslim countries, altered the religious landscape, challenging Europe's traditional Judeo-Christian identity. After World War I, pre-war trends in physics, psychology, and medical sciences accelerated. In physics, new discoveries and theories challenged the certainties of the Newtonian universe by introducing the ideas of relativity and uncertainty. Psychology, which became an independent field of inquiry in the end of the 19th century, demonstrated that much human behavior stemmed from irrational sources. By the mid-20th century, dramatic new medical technologies prolonged life but created new social, moral, and economic problems. During World War II, the potential dangers of scientific and technological achievements were demonstrated by the industrialization of death in the Holocaust and by vast destruction wrought by the atomic bombs dropped on Japanese cities. It became clear that the science could create weapons powerful enough to end civilization. The art would, in the 20th century, was defined by experimentation and subjectivity, which asserted the independence of visual arts from realism. Futurism glorified the machine age. Dadaism satirized traditional aesthetics, and Expressionism and Surrealism explored the relationship between art and the emotions of the unconscious. In the interwar period, the slogan, "Form follows functions," expressed a desire by architects to render the space in which we live and work more efficient. Throughout the century, American culture exerted an increasing pull on both elite and popular cultures in Europe. The widely held belief in progress characteristic of much 19th century thought began to break down during World War I. The experience of war had intensified a sense of anxiety that permeated many facets of thought and culture, giving way to the century's end of plurality of intellectual frameworks. When World War I began, Europeans were generally confident in the ability of science and technology to address human needs and problems, despite the uncertainty created by the new scientific theories in psychology. The effects of World War and economic depression undermined this confidence in science and human reason, giving impetus to existentialism, producing postmodernism in the post-1945 period. Science and technology yielded impressive material benefits, but also caused immense destruction and posed challenges to objective knowledge. The challenge to certainties of the Newtonian universe in physics opened the door to uncertainty in other fields by undermining faith in objective knowledge, while also providing the knowledge necessary for the development of nuclear weapons and power, including Werner Heisenberg, Erwin Schrödinger, Enrico Fermi, and Niels Bohr. Medical theories and technologies extended life but posed social and moral questions that eluded consciousness across religious and political philosophical perspectives, including eugenics, birth control, abortion, fertility treatments, and genetic engineering. Military technologies made possible industrialized warfare, genocide, nuclear proliferation, and the risk of global nuclear war. Organized religion continued to play a role in European social and cultural life, despite the challenges of military and ideological conflict, modern secularism, and rapid social changes. The challenges of totalitarianism and communism in Central and Eastern Europe brought mixed responses from Christian churches, including Bonhoeffer, Niemöller, Pope John Paul II, and Solidarity. Reform in the Catholic Church found expression in the Second Vatican Council, which redefined the Church's dogma and practical practices and started to redefine its relations with other religious communities. Increased immigration into Europe altered Europe's religious makeup, causing debate and conflict over the role of religion in social and political life. During the 20th century, the arts were defined by experimentation, self-expression, subjectivity, and the increasing influence of the United States in both elite and popular culture. New movements in visual arts, architecture, and music demolished existing aesthetic standards, explored subconscious and subjective states, and satirized Western society and its values, including Cubism, Futurism, Dadaism, Surrealism, Abstract Expressionism, and pop art. Architectural, including Bauhaus, Modernism, and Postmodernism, and music, including Stravinsky, Schoenberg, and Strauss. Throughout the century, a number of writers challenged traditional literary conventions, questioned Western values, and addressed controversial social and political issues, including Franz Kafka, James Joyce, Remarque, Woolf, and Jean-Paul Sartre. Increased imports of United States technology and popular culture after World War II generated both enthusiasm and criticism. Key Concept 4.4. Demographic changes in economic growth, total war disruptions of traditional social patterns, and competing definitions of freedom and justice altered the experiences of everyday life. The disruptions of two total wars, the reduction of barriers to migration within Europe because of economic integration, globalization, and the arrival of new permanent residents from outside Europe, changed the everyday life of Europeans in significant ways. For the first time, more people lived in cities than in rural communities. Economic growth, although interrupted by repeated wars and economic crises, generally increased standards of living, leisure time, despite the growing number of two-career families, educational attainment, and the participation in mass cultural entertainments. The collapse of the birth rate to below replacement levels enhanced the financial well-being of individual families, even as it reduced the labor force. To support labor force participation and encourage families, governments instituted family policies supporting child care and created large-scale guest worker programs. Europe's involvement in an increasingly global economy exposed its citizens to new goods, ideas, and practices. Altogether, the disruptions of war and decolonization led to new demographic patterns. A population increase followed by falling birth rates and the immigration of non-Europeans, and to uncertainties about Europeans' cultural identity. Even before the collapse of communism and continuing afterward, a variety of groups on both the left and right began campaigns of terror in the name of ethnic or national autonomy and the radical opposition to free market ideology. Other groups worked within the democratic system to achieve nationalist and xenophobic goals. By the 1960s, the rapid industrialization in the previous century had created significant environmental problems. Environmentalists argued that the unfettered free market economy could lead Europe to ecological disaster, and they challenged the traditional economic and political establishment with demands for sustainable development sensitive to environmental, aesthetic, and moral constraints. At the same time, a generation that had not experienced either economic depression or total war came of age and criticized existing institutions and belief while calling for greater political and personal freedom. These demands culminated with the 1968 youth movements in Europe's major cities and challenges to institutional authority structures, especially those of universities. Feminist movements gained increased participation for women in politics, and before the end of the century, several women became heads of government or state. Yet traditional social patterns and institutions continued to hinder the achievement of gender equality. While these internal movements and struggles went on, immigrants from around the globe poured into Europe, and by the end of the century, Europeans found themselves living in multi-ethnic and multi-religious communities. Immigrants defied traditional expectations of integration and assimilation, and expressed social values different from 20th century Europeans. Many Europeans refused to consider the newcomers as true members of their society, and in the early 21st century, Europeans continued to wrestle with issues of social injustice and how to define European identity. The 20th century was characterized by large-scale suffering brought on by warfare and genocide, as well as tremendous improvements in the standard of living. World War I created a lost generation, fostered disillusionment and cynicism, transformed the lives of women, and democratized societies. World War II decimated a generation of Russian and German men, virtually destroyed European Jewry, resulted in the murder of millions, and other groups targeted by Nazis, including Roma, homosexuals, people with disabilities, and others, forced large-scale migrations and undermined pre-war class hierarchies. Mass production, new food technologies, and industrial efficiency increased disposable income and created a consumer culture in which greater domestic comforts such as electricity, indoor plumbing, plastics, and synthetic fibers became available. New communication and transportation technologies multiplied the connections across space and time, transforming daily life and contributing to the proliferation of ideas and to globalization, including the telephone, radio, television, computer, cell phone, and internet. The lives of women were defined by family and work responsibilities, economic changes, and feminism. During the World Wars, women became increasingly involved in military and political mobilization, as well as in economic production. In Western Europe, through the efforts of feminists, and in Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, through government policy, women finally gained the vote, greater educational opportunities, and access to professional careers, even while continuing to face some social inequalities, including the works of Simone de Beauvoir and the second wave feminism. With economic recovery after World War II, the birth rate increased dramatically, the baby boom often promoted by government policies. This includes neonatalism, subsidies for larger families, and child care facilities. New modes of marriage, partnership, motherhood, divorce, and reproduction often gave women more options in their personal lives, including the pill and the scientific means of fertilization. Women attained high political office and increased their representation of legislative bodies in many nations, including Margaret Thatcher of Great Britain, Mary Robinson of Ireland, and Edith Cresson of France. New voices gained prominence in political, intellectual, and social discourse, including the Green parties in Western Europe and Central Europe challenged consumerism, urged sustainable development, and by the late 20th century cautioned against globalization. Gay and lesbian movements worked for expanded civil rights, obtaining in some nations the right to form civil partnerships with full legal benefits or to marry. Intellectual and youth reacted against perceived bourgeois materialism and decadence, most significantly with the revolts of 1968. Because of the economic growth of the 1950s and 60s, numerous guest workers from Southern Europe, Asia, and Africa immigrated to Western and Central Europe. However, the economic downturn of the 1970s, these workers and their families often became targets of anti-immigrant agitation and extreme nationalist political parties, including the French Nationalist Front and the Austrian Freedom Party.